those of you who don't know me, I'm Shiraz Mayer. I'm one of the lecturers here in the department, and I'm Deputy Director of ICSR. I won't be speaking very much at all. I'll be handing over to my colleague John, but I think it's worth reflecting for a moment upon what John will be presenting today, because it really does represent and mark, in many respects, how the world has changed quite a lot in the last few years. This is something that would have traditionally been something outside of the remit of ICSR, but ICSR is responding and evolving to a dramatically changing world. And John is really at the forefront of that with us in terms of looking at some of these issues. We've recently secured a major grant and we'll be launching a big project alongside this, which John will also be part of, looking at how Islamists and jihadists are governing in newly sort of ungoverned spaces, so state collapses in Syria, Yemen, Libya and elsewhere, and we're looking at how these groups can fill those spaces, offer alternatives, because we see that as being the next sort of evolution of how some of these issues take hold on the ground in local communities. And so to that end, John has been leading some very exciting work for us on the Kurds. He's travelled out to the region, he's done a lot of background into this as well. And so it gives me great pleasure to hand over to him today and to let him talk to you about some of the work that he's been doing. So, John, over to you.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Nice to see so many people here today. I know it's August and some people are vacationing or getting work done. It is in the middle of the day, but it's really nice to see some interested people here. And I hope that we can learn something together and have this presentation now and then have a discussion after. We could flesh out some of these ideas that mean a lot to me and could be very interesting to you. So, first, let's start with the context of the presentation. First, I'm going to sort of set the stage a little bit, show a map of Iraq and Syria as about a month ago, why it matters. The Kurds, talk about just a little touch on, for those who are not familiar, a little brief on what the Kurds are about. Then I'm going to focus on the PKK and their affiliates in the SDF, the YPG, PYD. We'll talk about them shortly and why that matters for the Syrian civil war. Then I'll move on to the key findings, where I'll present two ones in particular from the report in front of you, before moving on to an implication section, where I'll discuss sort of the main conclusions and takeaways I have based off of the research that I've done. Firstly, this is actually a map of Syria and Iraq of a week ago from Live UA Maps, who cited in the report in front of you. And here we can see some of the main battle lines in Syria and Iraq today. And I want to just pause for a little bit and reflect on them. First, in Iraq, you see this territory in red. This is territory controlled by Iraq's security forces. In Syria, on the other hand, this is territory controlled by the Assad regime and his proxies. In the light green, we have the opposition, the more mixed with the Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, al-Nusra, and their predecessors, whatever name they go by these days, along with more mixed, more moderate opposition. But I want to focus on three actors in particular for the purpose of this presentation. First, you have this territory in black, which is controlled by ISIL, the so-called Islamic State, whatever you would like to refer to it as. And secondly, you have this territory in yellow, which I like to hone in on today. And in Iraq, this territory is controlled principally by the Iraqi Kurds, the Kurdistan regional government, which is a semi-autonomous region within Iraq, has their own armed forces, and operates often outside of the remit of the Iraqi security forces. And here in northern Syria, stretching from the northeast, from Hasaka, all the way to the Afrin Canton in the west, this is territory controlled by the PKK and their affiliates, as I'll explain later on, the PYD, the SDF, the YPG, and their affiliated armed forces. And here in the dark green, we see this little toll of the territory that's a product of Operation Euphrates Shield, launched about a year ago. We'll discuss later in the presentation, but is controlled by the Turkish security forces and their affiliated armed groups that are some elements of the Free Syrian Army. But today, I'm focusing on these two actors, the Turkey and PKK and their affiliates, and what impact these two actors have and what role they have to play in reshaping the Middle East in the future. So briefly about the Kurds. They're an ethnic group estimated between about 3 million and 45 million people in the world today, and they're predominant in these four countries. Here in the southeastern region of Turkey, we see their control of northern Syria as of about a year ago. We see this territory in Iraq, which roughly reflects the area controlled by the Kurdistan regional government, and they're in northwestern Iran. And so when we imagine the PKK and their affiliates, as we'll detail later, you can see that these borders are relatively porous, and that if you have ethnic Kurds on either side of these boundaries, it could exacerbate any transnational threat that they could pose to a Turkey or other groups in the area. So just keep that in mind. So now the PKK and their affiliates, and this understanding is buttressed by what's written in the report in front of you, but it backs up a lot of my conclusions I have. So I want to pause and talk a little bit about them. So the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, was established in 1984 by Abdullah Öcalan in Turkey. And initially they were calling for an independent Kurdistan within Turkey. It sort of morphed over time to be this Marxist-Leninist movement that's more focused on Kurdish autonomy and Kurdish rights than necessarily outright independence. And critically, they have a strong presence in Syria, and an historical one at that. From 1984 till 1998, they had refuge in Syria under Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current ruler of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, where they could freely operate training camps, have a representative office in Damascus, and it enabled them to be a springboard from which to threaten the internal security of Turkey. And the PYD was a political party that, in my research, was set up by the PKK in 2003 in order to act as their conduit to retain their influence in northern Syria after they were formally kicked out by the Assad regime in 1998 as a result of the Adana Agreement. Now, their armed forces, the YPG, or People's Protection Units, have, from the very beginning of the conflict, been at the forefront of the anti-ISIL coalition's campaign in Syria. And why am I focusing on them? Because I believe the PYD is not just an offshoot of the PKK, as the U.S. coalition likes to say, but in fact, they don't just share an ideological affinity, but also an institutional one with the PKK. I think that the leaders of the PYD are more nominal leaders who have some power, but the real decision makers are the PKK, whether that's in Turkey or the Kandil Mountain Range in Iraq, where they have one of their headquarters. And so that means that their armed forces, the YPG, the People's Protection Units, in my mind, are often guided, if not led, by PKK priorities and forces of their own. And that eventually posed a problem for the U.S.-led coalition, because in Turkey's mind, if the U.S. is supporting the YPG to liberate Kobani, to take northeastern Syria away from ISIL, then they're essentially supporting a terrorist organization which the U.S. has listed on their foreign terrorist designation list for a long time. PKK is a terrorist organization, according to NATO, the EU, and many prominent international bodies. So by supporting the YPG, who have this close affinity with the PKK, according to Turkey, the U.S. is supporting the exact people that they said they wouldn't be able to arm or support, and instead would fight against. And so, recognizing that, while upholding the fiction that the PYD and the YPG are significantly different than the PKK, the U.S. helped the YPG create the Syrian Democratic Forces in October 2015, whose flag is right here, with a combination of elements of the Free Syrian Army and other local Arab forces that has some popular legitimacy in the ISIL-held areas of Syria. Now, why does this matter? Brett McGurk, as of 2 days ago, the presidential envoy for the anti-ISIL coalition, said that this force, the SDF, mixed Arab-Kurdish force, had retaken 50% of Raqqa. Now, these guys have been at the absolute front lines of the fight against ISIL. You see some of these banners of these sort of Arab-controlled, dominated units, and you see the YPG banners here. But what I like to poke a hole in is the myth that the SDF is a mixed Arab-Kurdish force of relatively equal footing. In fact, I believe the Arab component is much more the junior partner in this arrangement. They're not the ones on the front lines. They're manning the reserve theater operations. They're the ones that are disorganized. They're not leading the charge. Who is leading the charge? The YPG. Again, ostensibly a group that's related very synonymously with the PKK, in my mind. So when we view the SDF's capture of Manbij, when we see their impending recapture of Raqqa, we should think of them as principally guided by PKK priorities versus sort of an Arab joint force with the Kurdish ones. So moving on to my key findings. Number one, the PKK has been instrumental from the very beginning for the anti-ISIL campaign, and I'll show some of the evidence behind that shortly. Number two, their growing power in the region has posed an existential threat to the Turkish state, and their policies in both Syria and Iraq and internally are reflective of that, and it will have a huge impact on the future of the Middle East. We'll sketch out some of these things throughout this presentation. Number one, So here's a picture of Iraqi Kurdistan forces who were fleeing in the wake of the ISIL offensive going towards Erbil in the summer of 2014. This is a time when they were on their heels, looked like ISIL was this ever-conquering force, and the Peshmerga, the armed forces of the Kurdistan regional government, were in complete rout. What ended up buttressing their defense was an element of the Peshmerga's call to the PKK affiliates for aid. And what they did is that these guerrillas, as they were so called, integrated themselves with the Peshmerga forces or elements of them. All of a sudden you had battle-tested fighters, battle-hardened commanders who fought Turkish forces for decades, and they helped turn the tide. So all of a sudden, this was the critical moment in my mind, the inflection point from which the Kurdistan regional forces, integrated with elements of the PKK and their affiliated groups, helped reverse ISIL's gains in Iraq. This is on top of the rescues of the Yazidis from Sinjar Mountain, which in my mind was enabled by the PKK and the YPG's ability to access the mountain, provide a safety humanitarian corridor for refugees to leave, and give the operational space for air evacuations from the US-led coalition. And we should remember that this was the moment when the Obama administration decided to get involved in Iraq. This was the starting point. They wanted to help the Yazidis, lend an extended hand. This was the moment where the world called for the US's aid. And the PKK and their affiliates were there from the very beginning. And then quickly, I will talk about this siege and liberation of Kobani, which is a city in northern Syria, strategically located just to the south of the Turkish border. And here, the YPG was under extreme duress by ISIL. It looks like the so-called caliphate was going to conquer this critical border area. What ended up turning the tide was when this Turkish border was eventually opened. Now, how did that come about? President Erdogan had closed the border before because he didn't want militants of unknown origin, most likely the PKK, to cross some Turkish territory south, reinforce the YPG, defeat ISIL, and only strengthen their project in northern Syria. But with the US-led coalition applying intense diplomatic pressure, and with the Kurdistan regional government said they would monitor the weapons and access to the supplies to these fighters, President Erdogan bowed to that pressure, opened the border, and suddenly the YPG was reinforced. They liberated Kobani, and I believe that was the inflection point in Syria of ISIL's decline. So here, this is a map from about a year ago, actually, I think August 23rd, 2016, where we see all this territory ostensibly controlled by the PYD, who again are the political party that dominates the SDF and the YPG armed forces. And they control a huge swath of northeastern Syria, and including the Afrin canton here. What I wanted to point out for the purpose of this presentation is the city of Manbij. Now, why is Manbij important? Well, it's primarily an Arab-dominated city. There is a Kurdish population, but it's predominantly Arab, and it lies to the west of the Euphrates. Now, for Turkey, this crossed a red line. For months, they had said that if the SDF and the Kurdish forces crossed to the west of the Euphrates, it would provoke an incursion on their part. The reason is that they don't want this whole border being under the PKK, ostensibly the PKK domination, because that could serve as a launching platform from which they could continue to destabilize Turkish interests in Turkey itself in the future. So by crossing the west of the Euphrates, and primarily an Arab zone here, the SDF have gone one step too far. And I'll talk about Turkish response to this in a moment. And when we think about Turkey, we should think about a country that's at a very volatile frame of mind. There are 3 million Syrian refugees in the country. They suffered a coup attempt about a year ago that rocked the stability of the state. Several ISIL terrorist attacks and PKK terrorist attacks have hit major cities, Gaziantep, Ankara to Istanbul. This is a country that's really feeling the pressure. And so when we look at Iraq and Syria, we should view what they're doing there as an extension of their own domestic instability, as a further battleground that they can push their influence and interests. So here's a picture from about 2 weeks ago of what's happened as a result. Here in this dark green, Operation Euphrates is the product of Operation Euphrates Shield, which was launched in August of 2016, shortly after the SDF took Manbij, and they were advancing on this key border town of Jarablus, which is not marked here, which was controlled by ISIL. Turkey decided to go in with Turkish-backed forces from the Syrian opposition alongside their own security forces, and eventually, within 7 months, carved out a 2,000 square kilometer territory in northern Syria. Now, the territory now runs from the north of Jarablus all the way south to Al-Bab. And it was partially successful. Why? Well, they cut off, it appears, the Kurdish connection that could have been bridged right here. So that's a partial win for them. But they had two other objectives that remain unmet that I think we should be concerned about going forward. Number one, they wanted to influence the recapturing and holding of Raqqa, a city, again, 50% controlled by the SDF at the moment, and is completely surrounded. Now, how would they get there? Two routes. One route, from Al-Bab, they would go south, skirting the river Euphrates, and come up north to Raqqa. But as soon as the Turkish security forces were taking Al-Bab, the Syrian regime made a tactical decision to push this direction all the way to Euphrates to cut them off from any further southern advances. And I don't believe President Erdogan wants to risk a fight with Assad's regime. So that route's cut off. What's the other route, which ties into their second objective, was to retake the city of Manbij from the SDF. But the US-led coalition has made very clear that that will not be in the hands of Turkey anytime soon. They've had US tanks go through the city with American flags on the top of it, and they've said this is a city that we want the SDF or their provincial councils, local councils to govern, not the Turkish state. So that route, that if they had taken Manbij, could have gone across the river Euphrates and skirted down to Raqqa, has also been ostensibly closed. So if I'm Turkey, I'm looking at this map and I feel quite boxed in. And if I'm a destabilized power, I could use some unexpected and extreme measures going forward in order to try to change the balance and knock the PKK opponents off balance as well. Moving on to Iraq quickly. Here we see this town of Bashika, which is just northwest of Mosul. And about 2 years ago, Turkey decided to send hundreds of special forces to this town in order to ostensibly train Arab forces to retake Mosul. Now, the Iraqi government reacted with extreme hostility. This is a violation of sovereignty, it was unauthorized, and the US coalition backed them right up. But Turkey said, no, this is in accordance with our agreements with the Kurdistan regional government based in Erbil, and it dominates this area in northern Iraq, and we were there on their invitation. This is our friendly power inviting us in. Now, ostensibly, if it's not to recapture Mosul, because Mosul's being recaptured, what are they there for? Still, to this day. They say they want to prevent Tel Afar, a primarily Turkoman town, from falling into the hands of the Iraqi Shia militias. And that's fair enough. But I believe that their most important objective is to ensure that this town of Sinjar does not remain in the hands of the PKK and their affiliates. After the Yazidis were liberated from Sinjar Mountain, the PKK and their affiliates took Sinjar. And why is that of interest to them? If the PKK are dominant in northeastern Syria, Sinjar provides a useful rear support base for their operations and exacerbates the transnational threat that Turkey faces in Iraq and Syria. Now, Turkey has pushed very hard for the Kurdistan regional government to take them out of Sinjar. And in fact, there have been skirmishes between KRG-affiliated forces and the forces under the PKK. But I think that's where it's going to end. Because in my mind, I think both the PKK and the Kurdistan regional government don't want to shed too much Kurdish blood. There comes a point that it harkens back to the Iraqi-Kurdish civil war of the 1990s, and they're not willing to cross that in my mind. And so how the Turks are going to have friendly forces take Sinjar will probably be through hard-nosed diplomacy, or if they're willing to escalate the conflict even further. So what are the main implications as I close? Number one, and most interestingly for me, the US has decided that despite the terrorist designation of the PKK, they're going to continue to support their affiliated forces in the face of fierce Kurdish opposition. And here's a picture of some evidence of that. Here's some special forces in Raqqa province. Here's a badge of a group affiliated with the YPG. Now, this was not sanctioned by the US government. They got a lot of heat for it, and they said this was an independent soldier's actions and was probably punished in some way. But this is reflective of the fact that the US administration has not backed down and has in fact doubled down their support for the Kurds, despite Turkish pressure. The reason is they view the Kurds, the PKK, the SDF, the YPG, all in the same category, as the critical actors they need to secure ISIL-held territory away from the so-called Islamic State. And they're willing to risk their bilateral relationship with Turkey, their NATO partner, in order to do that. And here's a picture of Raqqa. I would love to talk more about in the discussion section if you'd like, where again, the SDF are the ones who have completely surrounded Raqqa. They're the ones who the Trump administration, in an executive order last month, decided to explicitly arm the Kurdish elements of the SDF with heavy anti-tank weapons and more special forces. They're not shy about the fact that it's not the SDF, the mixed Arab Kurdish force. No, it's the Kurdish elements of the SDF. So we'll see how Turkey responds to that in the future. Which brings me to my second point. If I'm Turkey and I'm facing this incredibly destabilized situation in my own country, I look to Iraq and Syria with extreme trepidation to my south. I see the PKK stronger than ever in both Iraq and Syria and can pose a medium, short, and long-term threat to my way of life. And so I think we should look very closely into how Turkey deals with this situation and could resort to more unexpected extreme measures going forward to combat the PKK's influence. That can include maybe finding another route to Raqqa. SDF might take Raqqa, who's going to hold Raqqa? That could be a question they might try to influence. They might try to do some skirmishes outside of the Afrin canton, a rumored offensive that's existed for a long time in that pocket of northwestern Syria we talked about earlier. So we should watch that carefully. And finally, this war between the PKK and Turkey will severely complicate any peace deals. It could very much complicate any future advances against ISIL, as the coalition with Turkish and U.S. cooperation could unravel when these climatic issues rub and there's friction between them. And finally, these conflicts in both Iraq and Syria could become a lot more deadly fast if Turkey and the PKK decide to ramp up their hostility to one another. Turkey has already killed hundreds of SDF YPG forces, whether it's in northeastern Syria or it's with airstrikes outside of Sinjar, with the U.S. extremely hostile to those measures. Turkey believes this is part and parcel of the PKK's terrorist designation. They have the latitude to do that. But you can very easily imagine that this situation is not sustainable, where the PKK is the predominant power in northern Syria and has a large presence in Iraq. So hopefully this presentation has given us a better understanding of what's occurring in Iraq and Syria. Eager to discuss more with you, talk about these issues going forward, and thank you very much for coming.